those of you who are joining a summer program for the first time, just want to briefly introduce Sama that we are a feminist resource organization working since 1999. It's been for over 2 decades, and Sama works on the issues of public health importance from a gender and intersectionality lens. Issues of social justice, reproductive justice, disability justice have always underlined and guided Sama's engagement across many issues, whether it was, sexual and reproductive health rights, gender-based violence, public health strengthening of looking at the health systems, or access to medicines. There are many issues that emerge across these intersections, on which Sama's work, including a topic that we are discussing today, that how these conversations are so much needed, so much required to, to bring more people, to bring more actors, experts, researchers, and other individuals, and to have a larger conversation around many issues that raise complexities.
We at Sama are very happy to be able to organize this webinar series on sickle cell disease, starting off with today's titled The Conceptual Constitution of Disability, a public health understanding of sickle cell disease and multiple sclerosis. This series is a part of our ongoing work on sickle cell disease, and we actually have other webinars scheduled in the upcoming weeks. To just provide a little background of Sama's work on sickle cell disease, since 2018, Sama has been engaged in research and advocacy on sickle cell disease and its management. We conducted a research project titled From the Margins to the Center, a study on the health inequities among the tribal communities in selected districts of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Orissa, which was commissioned by the National Human Rights Commission. And this research aimed to understand the status of public health services in these areas, the availability and utilization by the tribal population, and the factors that impact their access to healthcare. Looking at hemoglobinopathies, of which SCD is, or sickle cell disease is one part, was a part of this project. In taking this work forward, Sama has now been looking at sickle cell disease in more detail through a feminist and public health lens in tracking and interrogating the intersections of gender and sickle cell disease. So the Sama team conducted exploratory field visits in Chhattisgarh in March, April of this year in the districts of Raipur and Sarguja. Our interactions with the community, public health practitioners, patients' rights advocates highlighted the importance of approaching the management of sickle cell disease with a critical lens. And this was especially in questioning the ethics and implications of the approach of prevention and elimination in the context of a genetic blood disorder, which was implemented through the National Sickle Cell Anemia Elimination Mission by the central government in 2023. We thought it imperative to interrogate this concept of elimination while foregrounding gender as a core attribute. And so it became important for us to also understand the social context and gendered experiences of the disease and its treatment to evaluate the efficacy and ethical implications of such interventions at a mass scale. To take this conversation forward, Sama organized a one-day roundtable on July 2nd, 2024, titled Sickle Cell Disease as a Public Health and Reproductive Justice Issue. And some of you attending this webinar today had also attended our roundtable and were with us and were part of those discussions that day. The roundtable brought together experts and health activists working on sickle cell disease to discuss challenges and successes in the provision of care for patients, implementation of policies and programs, to consider the perspectives of patients' rights groups, the ethical and policy implications of such interventions, and to interrogate sickle cell disease as a feminist public health issue through the lens of reproductive justice and disability justice. The roundtable led to extremely insightful conversations and highlighted important perspectives from experts and practitioners alike. In building on these conversations that emerged from the roundtable, Sama is now organizing this series of webinars on the subject. The question of disability and genetic and chronic illnesses was one that also came up during our roundtable discussion, and we thought it was important to take this conversation forward. This webinar today aims to do so by looking at the intersections between disability rights, language around disability, and chronic and genetic illnesses, with a specific focus on sickle cell disease and multiple sclerosis. Our speakers today are experts in their field, and we're looking forward to the presentations and discussions today, which I'm sure will yield new insights and questions on our approach to the subject as activists, thinkers, and advocates. I will introduce our speakers for today's webinar and then hand over the proceedings to Dr. Rama Baru. So our facilitator for today is Dr. Rama V. Baru. Dr. Rama Baru is a retired professor from the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is an honorary fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi, and an honorary professor at India Studies Center, Central China Normal University in Wuhan, China. Her research focus is on social determinants of health and infectious diseases, health policy, international health, privatization of health services, and inequalities in health. She was formerly a member of the Technical Advisory Group for Lymphatic Filariasis at WHO Geneva. She is currently on several research and ethics committees in the Indian Council for Medical Research, Department of Health Research, and the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in India. Most recently, she has been invited to be a member of the Strategic Technical Advisory Group for Infectious Hazards at the WHO in Geneva. Our discussant for today, Shampa Sengupta, is a Kolkata-based activist working on the issue of disability and gender rights for the last 4 decades. A special educator by training, she is a founder-director of Shruti Disability Rights Center. Her focus of work currently is to bring in changes in laws and policies intersecting at the intersection of disability and gender. Our speakers for today are Dr. Sanghamitra Das. Dr. Sanghamitra Das works at the intersection of science, technology, medicine, and society. Her specializations include medical anthropology, science and technology studies, and South Asian studies. She received her PhD from Arizona State University and is currently a postdoctoral fellow in anthropology and Southern Asian studies at the University of Chicago. Dr. Sanghamitra Das has worked extensively on sickle cell disease, so we are very excited to have her here and share her research with us. Rohini Kandhari is an independent researcher based in New Delhi. Her interest is in ethnographic research in health, examining daily life with illness from patient perspective. She's currently collaborating with the Delhi chapter of the Multiple Sclerosis Society of India, which is a patient organization, on a study on multiple sclerosis. Sarojini and I, Keertana, are feminists and public health researchers associated with the Sama Resource Group for Women in Health in Delhi. Together with Gargi Mishra, we have looked into sickle cell disease from a feminist and public health lens, as well as an intersectional lens. The main findings from our research in Chhattisgarh were presented recently at the roundtable interrogating sickle cell disease as a public health and reproductive justice issue. And we looked into SCD from the perspective of patients' rights through community interactions at the ground level and examined it through these lenses. With that said, I now hand over our proceedings to Dr. Baru to take forward.
Thank you very much, Keertana, for that extremely, thoughtful and provocative way of looking at some of these conditions. And I want to congratulate Sama and the team for putting this webinar together, because I think it also helps to expand the entire idea of disabilities and how we look at the right to disabilities. By just stating it as a right, we don't really go into the many layers that are involved, from the lived experiences of people, their social position, and especially in sickle cell anemia, the levels of marginalization in terms of access to diagnostics, treatment, counseling, and also really sensitizing healthcare providers. Now, when you're looking at a whole range of blood disorders, including, and I'm sure Sanghamitra will speak more about it, whether you're looking at hemophilia or blood disorders, the question really is, how is it, in fact, incorporated into the understanding of disability? Because a lot of the disability discourse wants to quantify the quantum of disability in order to give it its status. Now, that is really problematic in situations where you have these kinds of chronic illnesses, which then have a lifelong impact, which are in a sense hidden because they are not visible to people who actually look at this section. And the other very important thing, I think, is the question which you raised, and which is also Adsa raised, which is this: we really need to interrogate elimination very seriously, because whether it is sickle cell anemia or many of the other infectious diseases, our experience has been that you use the word eliminate, then you use a deal of statistical history to change denominator numerators and declare them as eliminated. Actually, what happens is, even when new disease manifests itself, then it gets hidden and gets unnoticed, and the program no longer wishes to deal with it. If you have a disability of any blood disorders, how do you then get the disability card, which gives you the entitlements for the condition? And I'm very happy to have Rohini speak about multiple sclerosis because it is a very debilitating condition, and there are many stigmas and challenges that women face as they negotiate their daily lives with the condition of multiple sclerosis. Really looking forward to this, and thank you, Sarojini. Thank you, Samati, and over to you.
So thanks so much, and to all the panelists and participants, and Rama and Shampa. This presentation, as Keertana said, is based on our work put together by Gargi. Me and Keertana. Gargi could not make it to the webinar today for some personal reasons, but she's very much part of this presentation. So I just want to start with sickle cell disease in brief so that certain terminologies keep coming up in the presentation. It's a genetic condition or blood disorder, or, we put it in quotes, the disease that affects the hemoglobin. And in red blood cells, individuals with SCD have abnormal hemoglobin, which distorts the shape of red blood cells, making them crescent moon or, sickle shaped. So these distorted red blood cells get stuck in the small blood vessels in the body, blocking the blood flow, resulting in severe pain crisis, swelling of limbs, anemia, frequent infections, delayed growth, vision problems, organ failure, and also affecting the mental health. Most of the times we don't consider that in the category. So there are two things which we need to know that often come up. I'm sure Sanghamitra will elaborate on this later. I just wanted to, start with that. What we need to know in this entire sickle cell is there is a sickle cell trait, and then there is sickle cell disease. Sickle cell trait is different from sickle cell disease. The sickle cell trait, it occurs when a person carries one copy of the sickle cell gene passed down from one parent along with a normal hemoglobin gene from the other parent, and they're called AS. So when you're working with the people living with this sickle cell disease, you keep hearing these terminology even at the policy level. In contrast, people with sickle cell disease have two copies of the altered hemoglobin gene. They're called SS. So there's AS and there is SS. There is a trait and there is disease. So India has the world third highest number of global SCD births, following Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mainly prevalent here in central and western India, partly in south, and also in some parts of northeast like Assam. And within the country, mostly the historically, socio-economically marginalized communities like Adivasis, Dalits, and other marginalized castes, they have been reported to have higher prevalence of SCD. Keertana has already mentioned about the National Sickle Cell Anemia Elimination Mission, which was announced in 2023 budget session. Its vision is to elimination, I put it in quotes actually, of sickle cell disease as a public health problem before 2047. That is also quite interesting. It aims to do so through mass screening, premarital screening, prenatal testing, setting up genetic counseling in high prevalence districts. So the screening target over 3 years from 2023 to 26 is 7 crore people under the age of 40 years. So that is a target. So this targeted approach, in quotes, I say elimination of SCD involving Adivasi and other marginalized communities, it has been criticized by public health experts for stigmatizing these communities. We will discuss this in our next webinar. So unlike in many other countries, in India, SCD is included under the ambit of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that is RPWD Act 2016, as a benchmark disability. I put it in quotes. So according to the RPWD Act 2016, I'm not talking about the sections relevant. We can always go into that later. We don't have that kind of time. Maybe in the slide, I made it very clear that what does it mean? Person with benchmark disability means a person with not less than 40% of a specified disability, where specified disability has not been defined in measurable terms as certified by the certifying authority. So there is a confusion which arises with the words. Again, like I put it in quotes, where specified disability has not been defined in measurable terms, because the very words 40% indicate a measurement. So moreover, how do we measure disability, visible or invisible? So it itself is a very conceptual and also very critical question we need to ask. However, this 40% leaves out a lot of people who have disability condition, but the percentage is not 40% to fall under this benchmark disability. So sometimes it may so happen that a disabling condition that causes a huge impact on a person's life. However, that condition may not fulfill the criteria of benchmark disability. So it is important to value the experiences of those living with disability and how stigma and discrimination impact their lives, both physically and psychologically, and the extent they feel included and able to access resources and entitlements needs a very serious attention. I'm sure, that will be discussed later. So what does this act cover? It recognizes that SCD is a progressive and causes serious and permanent health problems, reduces life expectancy, affects educational and employment pursuits, and requires lifelong treatment and family support. So there are special provisions which have been made for persons with benchmark disabilities, even for children with benchmark disabilities. Again, that 40% comes here, okay? Between the ages of 6 to 18 have the right to access to free education. So the most important thing, I'm not going into all the provisions because I do not have that kind of time. The most important thing note here that minimum reservations of 4% in vacancies in government job posts have been to be made for persons with benchmark disabilities. But this excludes people with blood disorders, including SCD. So in benchmark disabilities, there are almost 20, I'm sure Rohini will come talk about that later. Also, there is thalassemia, there is MS, and there are many, many. So in that, what they have done is they have excluded people with blood disorders, including SCD and thalassemia. So it's quite paradoxical, that despite their recognition as disabilities in the Act, no government job reservations, for blood disorders. So many people with SCD, with benchmark disability, they have been denied government employment. So during our interviews, persons with SCD, and also with the patients' rights advocates, we have Gautam here, expressed their disappointment at the center's decision to exclude individuals with SCD from government job reservations, asserting that excluding disabilities recognized in the Act from job reservations defeats the Act's purpose itself. So in this entire context, disability certificates are a big issue. The Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment issues the certificates. Ministry of Health and Family Welfare is in charge of setting the criteria and rules for the certificates. Of course, there is a role for the Ministry of Tribal Affairs as well. So a certificate of permanent validity, is issued to persons with SCD, since SCD is considered a permanent disability. So it would be subject to a reassessment when requested by the patient or a medical authority. So a person would lose their eligibility for the disability certificate when they have undergone curative therapy, such as gene therapy, gene editing, hematopoietic stem cell transplant, or when new novel drugs become available. This is very important to keep in mind for the discussion, though you have something there, but at the same time, this is where we call inclusion and exclusion in our title. So this disability certificate, again, it plays a crucial role in accessing various government schemes, benefits, including reservations in education, employment, financial assistance, transport concessions, and assistive devices. So to avail of the disability certificate as issued under the Act, diagnosis report should be from a government lab or a standard laboratory. So availing the disability certificate requires the furnishing of confirmatory tests and documentation of medical complications arising out of SCD and their treatment. So the medical authority which certifies and evaluates disability is composed of a chairperson. It can be CMO or CHMO or the medical superintendent of a hospital or any treating doctor, specialist, or private medical practitioners, even that comes under this category. So for the, grading of disability, beyond the baseline of 40% is based on a scoring system that assigns points to a range of complications such as pain, requirement for blood transfusions, neurological complications, transfusion-related infections, and also liver dysfunctions. Moreover, there seem to be no tangible benefit that people with SCD can utilize through the health certificate. This is what we heard during our field visits. Awareness of the provision of disability certificates seem to be low among people with disability and also with the healthcare providers, like which we have come across in Chhattisgarh, evenly in other states where we were working on this topic. So till now, a total of 31,672 certificates have been issued for sickle cell as of 11th June 2024, as per the data obtained from the Unique Disability Identity Database. There is a database which is collecting all this information, but till now, these many certificates, that means not many people are rushing for these certificates. I touch on, a couple of issues here and then close it so that, Sanghamitra can take over. I'll talk about the privacy and confidentiality and protection and also the the non-discrimination here. So the process of obtaining and using disability certificates, it can also contain risks of invasion of privacy of the disabled individual or the people living with SCD. So the disability certificate has the person's name, photograph, address, duration of illness, and degree of disability, which can have negative consequences for the person's privacy. So exposure to such sensitive personal information, it can also lead to stigmatization and ostracization. So presenting their certification of disability to government workers and ticket checkers on demand is an undue burden. We heard that, people have to put it on their pockets, this, certificate, or carry with them wherever they go, which was also, quite humiliating at times, where you need to prove this to the officials. So this practice leads to frequent invasions of privacy for those who could otherwise keep their disabilities confidential. So respecting privacy is a fundamental right that upholds an individual's autonomy. Moreover, safeguarding this privacy is vital to prevent stigma, discrimination, and the resulting negative social, economic, and psychological impacts. I'll just conclude here. The imposition of a biomedical construction of disability has resulted in persons with SCD being denied affirmative measures promised under this Act. So thus the conceptual constitution of this category, I put it in quotes, the category, remains a big question that needs further interrogation. So there is an urgent need to address the roots of disparity, the long-term impacts of poverty, stigma, discrimination, and racism, as well as inequities in access to employment, education, healthcare, reproductive health rights, and justice. Without addressing these issues and bring in structural changes, any policy or any intervention can only narrowly benefit through a narrow view of disability to a marginalized community that is owed much more. Thank you.
Yeah, can we ask Sanghamitra now? Come in here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity, especially to Sama, for allowing me to present my published work here. I apologize in advance. I am in a zone of very unstable internet. So if it goes back, like if I get disconnected from the grid, I'll log back in. But hopefully that doesn't happen. So my apologies in advance. So today I wanted to discuss a little bit contextually about the paper that I had published in Medicine Anthropology Theory. So I would like for you to pay attention to the first segment of the title. Our blood itself is disabled. This is something that I often hear when talking to individuals with sickle cell disease. And this is what prompted me to write this article in the first place. This article came out in exactly 3 years ago in August 2021. And I would like to not repeat the things that Sarojini has put so very well contextually in terms of disability and genetic blood disorders in India. But if there is some overlap, I apologize in advance. But it is necessary to understand why the category of benchmark disability becomes a very biomedicalizing aspect of disability rather than a holistic model of disability justice. So with that, I'd like to begin my presentation reading a small excerpt from the article. One of the things that is important about the RPWD Act is the ways in which it describes sickle cell disease, hemophilia, thalassemia as disabilities. And these the nomenclature is actually of a progressive disability or a disease that progresses. But at the same time, the indication is that with progress, there can also be recess. That means at some point of time, individuals with sickle cell disease will feel completely fine. And that's when their disability status is in question. Within the ambit of the 2018 Disability Certification Guidelines, the procedures for ascertaining degree of disability and so determining whether an individual has quote-unquote benchmark disability for hemoglobinopathies, which include thalassemia as well as hemophilia, and all other included disabilities rely upon specific value judgments. The factor that is important in disability certification is to assert a benchmark disability. Now, how do we certify benchmark disability for individuals with sickle cell disease and other blood disorders? These become very subjective evaluations, as well as expert evaluations. So as you can see in the chart, there are all these values that you see in the disability guidelines, the guidelines for ascertaining percentage of disability. There are all these functions. As if you take a little bit of time to read, it has a lot to do with perception of pain, perception of discomfort. So there's so much of subjectivity that goes already into ascertaining benchmark disability, but at the end, the diagnosis is very clinical. And I was reading a little bit from the article itself. So I'll just quickly continue from there and then move on. Although drawing upon existing norms for arriving at a disability index, the existing norms, which include subjective as well as expert dimensions, alludes to a mutual constitution of medical standards and embodied experience. Now, Sarojini did tell us a little bit about the importance of understanding embodied experience. These embodied experiences, however, do not reflect in the policies, because what happens in the policies is that there is a certain diagnosis, and then there is a certain ascription of that diagnosis. But what happens in the processes of getting a disability certificate is somehow lost in the ivory towers of bureaucracy. So that is something we should think about in terms of expanding the disability rights discourse in India. For example, here in the third slide that I have, this is a tabular illustration of what disability would look like, and that is directly corresponding to those previous value judgments that were given in the guidelines for assessment, right? So the tabular illustrations from the disability certification guidelines pertaining to hemoglobinopathies depict how subjective experience form the basis of this assessment, leaving considerable room for experts who could be medical as well as bureaucratic, and a considerable room for expert interpretive flexibility, because oftentimes it is brushed off that they have a disability at all. So this interpretive flexibility continues from the perception that sickle cell disease is a progressive disease, that it waxes and wanes, its severity waxes and wanes. Whereas those of us who know personally the story of sickle cell disease are very familiar with the fact that something as simple as dehydration or a change in the humidity level or a change in the level of heat can lead to a very painful episode of a vaso-occlusive crisis, which is known as pain crisis, which is basically the agglutination of the blood cells in the veins. So this progressive aspect of sickle cell disease is a highly questionable aspect because it is the nature of the disease to wax and wane. And just because a sickle cell disease individual is feeling fine today doesn't mean that if they were to suppose carry a heavy bag, they wouldn't have a pain crisis the very next day. So these sorts of disability experiences should be kept in mind when we evaluate the gradation of disability that the current guidelines do indeed prescribe for medical officers. So one of the things that was a contestation in the disability rights discourse pertaining to sickle cell communities was the fact that the government of India, through the RPWD Act, required that you renew the certificate annually. This is a huge logistical and practical problem for the communities living with sickle cell disease. And I will talk about this a little later. Because of the protests and the discontents amongst sickle cell patient advocacy groups, this guideline was revised and it was a 3-yearly renewal. And after that, now we had a recent circular where the disability certificate for sickle cell disease is now considered to be a permanent certificate, right? So that is something that we need to understand, that we as disability scholars, we have to understand the ways in which these laws that are progressing also reflects the able-bodied environment in which disability activists, including sickle cell, thalassemia, hemophilia activists, have to operate to make their struggle legible. And then it's an excruciatingly slow process. It's a very incremental process, and it takes years at an end. And even after that, the results are not always satisfactory, as in the case of exclusion of blood disorders from employment-related affirmative actions, right? So one of the things that Sarojini already mentioned about this revision is the fact that even now, sickle cell disease is considered a temporary situation, but in a very sort of biomedical way. So this is an excerpt from the Gazette that I just took, and this is, of course, after it just came out this year, so this is not included in the article at all. So now sickle cell disease is considered a permanent disability, and the certificate also has permanent validity. But as Sarojini had mentioned, in case you get therapy, that is gene therapy or gene editing, whichever becomes applicable, in that case, the disability certificate will no longer be valid. Now, for me, this aspect in the Gazette, this aspect in the circular that has amended a rather sort of like a trenchant circular that thinks of disability, sickle cell disability as a progressive condition, I think that it falls into the same loophole once again, because first of all, gene therapy is not completely inexpensive, as in the case of hydroxyurea. If we look at hydroxyurea with its side effects, hydroxyurea, which is the only available treatment strategy now, costs much less than what gene therapy would cost even in the years when it becomes available and widely utilized. In that case, the cost prohibitive nature of this therapy will be important. But at the same time, there are significant risks also for gene editing, and it is a very new technology. It is not certain where this technology will lead sickle cell disability futures into. So one thing to note here is that the aspect of elimination that Sarojini talked about is, and the aspect of elimination that the Summer Roundtable raised is very much at the center of this stipulation that in case somebody gets gene therapy or in case somebody gets gene editing, you are no longer a disabled person. So that there is a teleology. That means once it is still a game of proving to the state that your disability matters, regardless of the therapeutic situation, which can be quite stratified according to race, caste, gender, economic situation. So the question of elimination, it seems, is very much still at the center of the disability rights, not the disability rights, like the disability legislation discourse in this country. So it is always assumed that it is better not to have sickle cell disease. So the ultimate goal of the government through mass screening, particularly among Adivasi communities, through reproductive and marriage counseling, is always to make sure that no children with sickle cell disease are born, which is something that bleeds into the right to exist discourse in the disability advocacy movements. Like, do sickle cell children have the right to exist? And if they exist, what are the conditions in which children and adults with sickle cell disease will be existing in this world? In an atmosphere, in a biomedical management atmosphere where elimination is preferred over other forms of managing a genetic condition, the people who do exist today, suppose gene therapy were to be well established, the people who do exist today will be more deviant, will appear more deviant, either because they do not choose gene therapy or because they are not able to. So this is a very ableist framing of what sickle cell disability future should look like. If we already have a stipulation in the guideline that says that gene therapy, you got gene therapy, whether or not it works, we will see later what the guidelines will be. If you have got gene therapy, if you are cured, you're no longer disabled. We don't know anything about relapsing, or we don't know anything about what the science of it will be. But at the very onset, the framework is a very ableist framework. One of the things that we have to consider is not just the existence of therapies, but the accessibility of therapies and the conditions in which accessibility becomes possible. Hydroxyurea is a far cheaper drug, but even hydroxyurea is not regularly available, or it's not consistently available in different locations, particularly in locations like Assam, where there is less knowledge about sickle cell treatment. That is something we have to think about. So when the atmosphere is such that you don't have hydroxyurea, and then there is this very futuristic technology that has come in to take on our imagination that we can live a life free of sickle cell disease, is also an imagination that we can live a life like a normal person. Like there is something wrong with someone who exists with sickle cell disease. So how will we consider these socio-political and ethical dimensions of being alive with sickle cell disease, right? So that is something that the elimination discourse misses. That if we eliminate, what of the people who still exist? And whether or not we eliminate, what if the sickle cell gene comes back again? And this brings us to the question of the trait and the diseased individual. The trait is such an interesting discourse. The discourse of the medical discourse of the trait is such an interesting discourse because people who have one sickle cell gene, who are considered biomedically the carriers, they're already seen as having a deviant gene. So even after all of this gene therapy elimination, if the traits will start appearing again, this sort of stigmatization of people, this labeling of people, this categorization of people will reappear, even if suppose elimination was a success story in India. So we have to take a step back, from the medical model and consider what does this model of elimination, what are the baggages, the eugenic, the caste-based, the gendered baggages that this question of elimination carry. And then there is again the matter of care for sickle cell disease, right? So what about strengthening the existing infrastructures so that care becomes possible for sickle cell disease? And for sickle cell disease, the care is mostly performed by women. And these, as we know, are communities who have traditionally inhabited forested areas. And because they have been in the forests, those communities have developed sickle cell disease, and those communities tend to be caste oppressed or Adivasi communities who have limited economic needs. So that means both the mother and the father has to work to have economic security in the family. So those kinds of questions, economic security of a sickle cell person, it is absolutely, not absolutely, but there's limited discussion on what happens to economic security in conjunction with sickle cell management. Just having a disability pension is often not enough. And even where there is where the disability pension knowledge that sickle cell individuals and communities with sickle cell disease can access disability pension, that itself, where the knowledge is prevalent, even there, the question of getting those certificates becomes a huge problem for the communities. I want to read out a narrative from a woman I met, an Adivasi woman, who was trying to get her disability certificate. And I asked her, do you get disability benefits? And this is in Tamil Nadu. She said, no, I don't receive disability benefits, but I have applied for the pension. I have not gotten it yet. Why they have not gotten it yet? We have to understand that oftentimes marginalized communities are also very, the access to education, access to economic empowerment is depressed amongst these communities. That means navigating the annals of bureaucracy become very challenging for the people. And consider the fact that for enabling economic security of the family, they have to often work as daily wage laborers. So when we have a disability certification process that is laden with so many progressive steps, it often means 2 to 3 days goes in actually figuring out the entire process, what documents are required, what needs to be produced to the commissioner. And even at the end of it, a lot of times there is sometimes medical discrimination, bureaucratic discrimination against Adivasis and Dalits. So going for a disability certification means you lose the day's work. And that means the children who are left at home who might not have sickle cell disease also go hungry. So that is a lived experience that is not very well represented in the policy discourse. And we have to think about, if we are to think about the most marginalized in a democratic society, then at least we have to think about the ways in which these channels of affirmative actions can be made more accessible to the marginalized people. But in a way that those disability certificates don't become stigmatizing agents, that you have complete confidentiality or privacy, or that the public health awareness campaigns are like public awareness campaigns that are not targeted. And those communities who know what this is, who want to avail these services, can themselves go in their own time to get these public health interventions and these disability cards without actually being pointed out that these are the communities that we need to target. I think that is something that we have to think about when we think about reproductive justice and sickle cell disease as well. First is the question of this progressive disease, a progressive nature of sickle cell disease. Second is the question of economic conditions of the people that are already marginalized and who are being targeted as the repositories of the sickle cell gene. And how do we make the channels of getting a disability certificate easier for those people who have been denied equal access to education and employment in this country for millennia? I think this is my last slide. I'm sorry for my internet connection and I'm sorry for the Jari presentation, but I hope the message came through. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sanghamitra. That was a set of cohesive, presentation, and many of your uh, from your study on multiple levels. You really spoke to us, despite the network connectivity issue. May I now request Rohini to join us here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're on.
Okay. Thank you, Sarojini and the Sama team for including MS in this conversation. And Professor Baru, it's good to have you at this webinar. So I won't waste time. I'll just begin. My talk today, titled Everyday Life with a Chronic Condition, a Case of Multiple Sclerosis in India. It's based on findings of an ongoing study that explores the lived experience of women in India with invisible disability associated with multiple sclerosis, or MS, which is a chronic neurological condition that affects more women than men globally. Another relevant point about MS, and there are many similarities also with sickle cell disease, is that about 85% of affected persons have relapsing remitting MS, where the person might be in remission for extended periods, and then symptoms reappear unpredictably, with the possibility of the condition progressing over time. The study is being held with the involvement of the Delhi branch of the Multiple Sclerosis Society of India, which is a patient organization. So the focus today will be one aspect of the study's emerging findings. And after discussing the findings, I'll also try, if there's time, to make some points on the Disability Act in relation to MS. So in-depth interviews with women revealed how everyday life with MS-related non-visible impairments such as fatigue and pain is structured in relation to their roles as daughters, wives, mothers, and daughters-in-law, and or the failure to meet gender norms and expectations. In other words, the invisible burden of MS, I argue, is another dimension of the taken for granted accommodations that women make daily in relation to the family. The interviews are hence analyzed using the conceptual framework of intersectionality to demonstrate how the social categories of gender and invisible disability intersect in the private sphere of the family, impacting daily life of the women. Now, of course, intersectionality is not a new framework, but it is still relevant and important, especially in the context of voices of women from countries like India. So just a sort of an outline on the framework as a reminder to what it means. Crenshaw first used the term intersectionality, defining it as a prism through which to examine how social categories or identities intersect to produce multiple levels of disadvantage. Within this framework, social categories such as gender and disability in this instance are revealed to mutually construct one another and work together to shape outcomes. Some identities might appear more dominant than others in particular contexts, creating and reinforcing inequalities in power relations. While each social category alters the experience of the other, it is important to know that human experiences are complex and nuanced, and people can face privilege and oppression simultaneously. In the context of this study, the women I met are from middle-class families. The family provides kinship, social and financial resources, but the family is also the structure of domination and control that shapes their daily lives with MS in various ways. Now, just a little brief outline on the research methods. This paper draws on in-depth interviews with 16 women with MS, the majority living in the NCR. Most of them are members of the MSSI, the Multiple Sclerosis Society, the Delhi chapter, that also selected the participants with the inclusion criteria of having invisible disability. Informed consent forms were given to the participants before the study. Their identities are anonymized, and the interviews were recorded with their permission and transcribed. The ages of participants ranged from their 20s to 50 years of age. This reflects the fact that MS typically affects this age group. 9 interviews were held in person and the rest online. And now further details of these participants will be revealed as we go through the themes, which are based on interviews. So please bear with my reading these excerpts. The first theme is domestic duties, gender expectations, and invisible disability. The diagnosis of MS for women precipitated a personal crisis that demanded a renegotiation of life direction, of interpersonal relations, and the relationship to oneself. For instance, Maya's diagnosis in her early 20s upended her life. I had so many plans, she said, recalling her preparations to leave home for a job in another city. But after MS, my priorities changed very quickly and I wanted to be close to my family, she said. According to Burry, a chronic condition is precisely that kind of experience where the structures of everyday life and the forms of knowledge which underpin them are disrupted. So what is the experience of women when the debilitating impact of hidden impairments hampers their ability to perform daily household routines is the question this theme explores. So Maya discussed her daily challenges to living at home with invisible disability. She said, "My father, I don't think he understands. Every morning I'll help my mother with the cleaning chores. Now, because of my fatigue and sometimes very severe pain in my hands and legs, I have spasms. I take things in my own way, I take things slow. Now, my father every day yells at me, 'You are so slow, why can't you clean things fast?' Every day he'll complain about it frankly. I never really stood up to him." So she goes on to say further, so the challenges are invisible and the symptoms are invisible. No matter how hard you try, even today I can't explain, I'll be questioned. You are absolutely fine. They'll say you're just trying to use your condition as an excuse and that you want sympathy and all of that. In the case of Meera, age 53, diagnosed in her 30s, is married and lives in a joint family. With household work, she said, "Why I could do 10 things, I was able to do 2 or 3. Sometimes my limbs also pain. These are all symptoms that you feel, but people can't easily see. No one knows the pain inside. No one understands also, and no one wants to understand." The thing is, even if they, she meant her in-laws, knew there was a problem, they didn't want to admit it. They brushed it aside, so that the daughter-in-law can keep working. Why I accepted, I am an educated maid, what else? According to Meera, this criticism she had experienced from her husband's family might have been somewhat mitigated if there was, in quotes, a visible anomaly, like a fracture. But in MS, it's going on inside, she said. So according to Moss and Dyke, who's also looked at women with chronic conditions, the embodied experience of a chronic condition defies standard definitions of illness and disability, since those affected, in quotes, are not quite well and they are not quite ill either, close quote. This state of being in between is a liminal state that women with MS occupy. Liminality, defined in the existing literature, is a fraught state due to the transgressions in the perception of others committed by those who occupy that space. In this instance, women have invisible impairments that lie outside normative definitions of disability, and their bodies defy what the impact of debilitating impairment should look like. Maya also transgressed on account of gender norms. Being unmarried at 31 and living in her natal home, she implied that her position in the household was ambiguous, of her atypically living in her parents' home and yet not knowing if she will indeed leave. So those who occupy a liminal space therefore pose a threat to the social order, becoming marginalized by those outside of it. In the excerpt of Meera's interview quoted earlier, she narrated how her in-laws, in having ignored her struggles with MS, had avoided upsetting the established arrangement of domestic responsibilities that rested on her. According to Pangas et al., persons in the liminal space typically desire recognition by others, but this need for belonging might never be fulfilled due to prevailing social and cultural norms. In the words of Meera, living with MS and in-laws is a big difficulty, and parents should come to your rescue. Parents don't do that. They feel that once they're married, the daughters, you don't belong to them. You come to this place, you don't belong to this place. So where do you go? The next theme is marriage, family, and the burden of disclosure. Having invisible impairments, said Zara, she's 29 years old, is a bit of a boon, she says, because I look okay, no one is looking at you. And being a woman, you get questions like, oh, will you be able to bear children? Will this have an impact on your pregnancy? And even if people don't ask these questions directly, I get the feeling they're thinking it. Close quote. To avoid the scrutiny of the woman's body, Zara said emphatically, in quotes, you have to protect yourself more than anything. So it is up to you when you tell that person. close quote. By person, she meant a prospective marriage partner. The choice of non-disclosure with invisible disability produces, she says, the feeling of normalcy. It is what makes things better that you're not different, close quote. However, there is a temporality to this act of non-disclosure, and eventually the silence of concealment must be broken. Zara envisioned the possible scenarios that might compel disclosure of her MS. I am at a stage where I don't need financial help, but you would need it because the medication is so expensive. And young women, more than anything, they need to secure themselves first. And financial dependence is the worst. In addition to financial support, you do need emotional help. So disclosure, another point, also becomes inevitable when women are faced with decisions of having children. According to Zara, I will have to do a very planned pregnancy. I will have to stop my medication for a while when I'm planning, probably switch to another one, which is in itself a big thing. Strategizing for the future with the lifelong demands of MS and the desire for marriage and children had posed the burden of disclosure on Zara. You shouldn't hide from your life partner something that's this big in your life, she said. The yet unknown life with MS outside the safety of her homes had taken in quotes, an emotional toll on her. I think my fear of getting married and all of that starts to bother you, right? In India, you don't just get married to the person, you get married to the family, she said. I now come to the last theme. A study in Canada by Isabel Dyke on women with MS explored how women, after having left their jobs due to MS, had to reconcile with the insularity of the home, having replaced a world of work and a public life in general. In the case of my study, the relationship to life outside the home for women currently in their 40s and 50s had already been circumscribed when they got married in their 20s and before they got MS. For instance, after marriage, Ritu said, my husband stopped me from going to my job. I didn't keep too many friendships, and then I was stuck with the family. At the time of the interviews, women like Ritu in their 40s and 50s age group had fewer domestic responsibilities as children had left home, in-laws had passed away, or merely because they were older women in the family. Ritu then tells me that now her husband is letting her work, but she said, now what can I do? Now that phase is over, I'm nearing 50, and at this point, should I balance myself? She has balancing issues, or do I go somewhere to work? So for these women whose lives have consistently been defined by the home and family, imagining a life outside the home with MS seemed overwhelming. In another instance, Anita, referring to her husband and father, said, they don't let me go alone anywhere. Anita said she felt, in quotes, normal. I don't feel that I have MS. So I think I'm in that silent period now, close quote. Yet the fear of managing MS in inaccessible public spaces was compounded by another kind of normalized patriarchal control, manifesting in the form of protection of women by the male members of the household. There was a generational difference, however, in how women viewed their MS in relation to the world outside. Those in their 20s and 30s had some kind of employment. For instance, Zara had a full-time corporate job. Her fears of MS, managing MS, like others her age, centered on disclosure and stigma in the context of the demands of marriage, pregnancy, and unlike the others who had already undergone this part of their life course. So this ends the insight into the private worlds of women with MS. And I'd like to end this section by citing Elizabeth Griffiths. She's an academic with arthritis, and she talks about her experience with an invisible condition in the workplace. And she states that the various theories of disability do not necessarily account for the fluctuation, which is what the earlier speaker also said, in chronic conditions. And the voices of the chronically ill have been relatively muted in the disability movement. And in this context, she argues that people are disabled by society and also by their bodies. And my body does let me down on occasion. And she cites literature that talks about bringing back the body experience into also the understanding of disability. That means being disabled by society, but also by your own body. I will now make some quick points on India's 2016 Disability Act, which is also similar to the discussions earlier. Like sickle cell disease, MS was also included for the first time in 2016, but the 40% disability benchmark has posed problems. I will read from the MSSI website about what their contention is. The 40% disability might not be applicable to all persons diagnosed with MS because the disability is invisible, such as fatigue, incontinence, imbalance, cognitive disorders, etc. MS is also episodic in nature, so the regulating authority, in order to determine disability, will have to reevaluate the frequency and length of the episodes of relapses, the time between relapses, and the presence of permanent impairments, even when there are little or no symptoms, due to medications and nature of the disorder itself. The guidelines therefore need to take into account invisible symptoms, and the criteria of 40% disability must be supplemented with the previous relapses that MS people experience. Another point, according to a person I interviewed who's also an advocacy person for the MSSI, is that she argues that if the minimum 40% benchmark is given to MS, then the certificate must be temporary. So there's a difference of opinion also within the MS community. She says because it should be temporary and maybe assessed within 4 or 5 years, because she says MS is often progressive. And so she said that then certain certain benefits are only given depending on the extent of disability. So therefore, it should take into account the condition progressing. And therefore, she says that the 40% must be temporary. She also argued that getting a certificate also means being counted in government data in far as MS is concerned, because there's very little data on MS. And often people with MS have got certificates on the basis of locomotor disability and not MS, because there is also little awareness of MS by those responsible for providing the certificate. And just a last point, with advocacy also by MSSI and the revised the March 2024 guidelines have made a neurologist on the assessment panel for the certificate compulsory. Because earlier people who I interviewed have not even bothered to try to get the certificates. Some have compulsions to get it, not all, even though they came from middle class backgrounds. But they said it's no point wasting time, because they said, I don't look like I have a disability, so I'm not going to go through the hurdle. Now, in this 24 guideline, they've made a neurologist compulsory for the assessment. And that gives hope, according to some in the MS community, because more than any other specialist on the assessment panel, the neurologist should have an idea of what invisible symptoms are in the assessment, because many of the specialists don't know what MS is and the range of conditions, because it affects the brain and spinal cord. There are a range of impairments that can affect people. And of course, having a neurologist itself is a hurdle. But this is one stipulation that the MSSI has fought for and they've got. So just to sum up, there are many challenges to having MS. Not just about the certificate, I focused on the aspect of women in their everyday domestic lives, but there is issues of insurance, of expensive medicines, of diagnosis, and other aspects. And so I will end my discussion here. Thank you.
Thanks, Rohini, for really further deepening this conversation today and talking to us about the intersection of MS and disability. At this point, I request Shampa to join us, who is the discussant for the webinar. Shampa, could you?
Thank you, Sama, for organizing this important discussion. And thank you, Sarojini, Sanghamitra, and Rohini for bringing out the issues pertaining mostly to, I'd say, invisible disabilities, because that is something we are talking more about today. But if I can go back a little, if we look at the historical background, since in the first disability law 1995, which is redundant now, Persons with Disabilities Equal Opportunities Act, there were like 7 kinds of categories of disabilities were included. even in 1995 Act, we didn't have like all seven categories didn't have reservation included in the reservation in jobs and educational institutes. So, from the beginning, our Indian law has always been a very, I mean, anti-discriminatory law is itself discriminates within categories of disabilities. Now, of course, the current law came into being only after, I mean, there have been a lot of demands from the activists to amend the previous law when UNCRPD, the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, was ratified by India. So the activists felt that the government also agreed that we need a new law. And so, I mean, since I've gone through the whole process of bringing changes in the law, you realize that it's very interesting because the new law, the 2016 law that includes MS and sickle cell disease and other blood-related disorders in the disability category, it is very interesting because the 2016 law starts by invoking CRPD. And CRPD itself is a rights-based document. It's not a document that looks disability from a medical model at all. So it's a very, if you're invoking, in the beginning only you were saying that we are bringing this new law because India has ratified CRPD. And also we have in our 2016 law, if you can look at the definition of person with disability, which is actually totally copied from CRPD. It says the person with disability means a person with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with barriers hinders his full and effective participation in society equally with others. So you are not only talking about impairment, you are talking about barriers. And the barriers are, of course, different. There are social barriers, there are physical barriers, there are different kinds of attitudinal barriers. If you are giving this kind of definition and at the end you are saying these are the categories of people who can be termed as disabled. And look at the certification process, it's completely in a medical model. Are we also when we are measuring disability, because it says that measurement is important, 40%, 50%, 60%, all these percentages are important to get a job or get pension or whatever benefits we are able to get from the state. So are we also measuring the barriers? Because disability itself is an intersectional experience. It depends on where you are located, your gender, it depends on your caste, your religion, everything. So you are just looking into the impairment part when you are measuring the disability and you're saying, okay, so this people will get 40%, this is 50%, and it's something, I mean, totally discriminatory way of looking at disability. And if I may bring in more uh, should I say bad news to people who are working on disability, because very recently we had this controversial case of Pooja Kenkar, who was accused of having misusing disability certificates. Apparently, she had 3 different certificates of low vision, blind, some other, I mean, 3 different categories. After that case came into light and a lot of controversies happened, Government of India's response to that case is now they're bringing a more difficult process of procuring certificates, which is out in they published it on 30th of July in their website, MSJ website, and they've said that within 30th of August, within 1 month, we are supposed to give our feedback to it. And it's very important to understand that now they are wanting more documents it will be longer process. I mean, these are all mentioned in the government document that came out on 30th of July this year. Um, so we have 1 month's time to respond to it, but given our experience of working with government officials in recent times, we have very not I mean, much hope that things will become really totally. Uh, I mean, even if we give our feedback, that things will be accepted by the government. So there are doubts about that. We also, it mentions that now we'll be having, the UDID was not enough. Now we'll be having color coded UDIDs. So below 40% will have some other color, 40% some other color. So, and this is all out there in the uh, public domain right now. So at this point of time, I think it becomes very difficult for us to, even as activists, we don't know where we are heading to, because if things are becoming much more complicated, because one person made some mistake, it was a corruption case, uh, so for that reason, every disabled person in the country will face more difficulty in getting procuring a certificate. That is a process that is being discussed right now within the movement. And I'm very happy that we are talking about the intersection of gender and disability in today's webinar. There are things that, even though our RPD Act actually mentioned, again, our national disability policy also mentioned women with disabilities. That policy also needs to be renewed anyway. So our RPD Act also talks about women with disabilities. However, this intersectional perspectives are not found, even though the law is there, the policy is there, the national policy is there. But unfortunately, when we are going to the ground level, when we are actually working in the field, we do not find people are actually, these laws or policies are getting implemented in any way. One thing we need to understand, that disability is again a state subject in our country. So every state can have their different disability rules, RPD rules. We have different rules. And for example, when Indian government was making the RPD rules, the central rules, even the law talks about women with disabilities. The RPD rules, the rules do not talk at all about the gender aspect at all. In some states, we have different rules. For example, in Tamil Nadu, we have a better rules. I'm from West Bengal. So West Bengal actually copied and pasted the central rules. So we do not have any gender component in West Bengal RPD rules. So there are different kinds of challenges that also comes when you're working on the intersection of gender and disability. There is, yeah, the law talks about it, but there is no implementation happening. And I just wanted to talk because that I was just looking at some of the comments that were coming. Also, because marriage, reproductive rights, these are the issues that have been often been discussed when we're talking about women with disabilities. Marriage itself is a challenging part for majority of all categories of disabilities of all categories. If you look at the woman life, but of course, when it is something as invisible as sickle cell disease or MS, and it's also not just invisibility; it's also you are targeted that you will be giving birth to a child who also becomes disabled, and that something makes life much more difficult because eugenics runs very we all want a perfect child to be born. So the whole theory of eugenics, how the genetic disorders actually looked into, that needs to be addressed. Of course, at this point of time, I think for us, for disability activists, the focus is on how to see that this new guideline on certification that Government of India came out with can be made a little simpler. That is something we are looking forward to. But I think the long-term goal is definitely to look into more into genetic studies, how reproductive rights are looked into, how marriage is a issue that, again, maybe in some other time I can share one of the study that we did is that in many states of India, there are marriage incentives given, money is given for marrying a disabled woman. So how, whether that is actually helpful or not, those kind of issues also we need to look into. Uh, uh, Thanks so much, and I hope we have some kind of open discussion also sometime left for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Shampa. We do have some time for open discussion. And before we open this up, I just want to circle back to our facilitator, Professor Baru. A lot of things have linked back to her initial remarks. So if Professor Baru, if you could join us again and add further to, to what you started and after hearing all the speakers and discussant.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very, very interesting and a rich discussion, and I don't wish to summarize it. But I think a couple of things Shampa said was very important. One, that this implementation of the disability law and the rules that are framed are at a state level. So there's going to be much variation in the way in which it is done. The second thing I want to highlight is that the complication and the layered nature of how intersections play out in terms of even access to disability services and the kind of stigmatization and humiliation that women face and are forced to live with. And I think that really is very, very important. And some of the cases that we heard from Rohini exemplify this. And also that diseases can be progressive. What you have today may get worse tomorrow. And how does this quantification really play out is, to me, very, very problematic. Somewhere I also feel that, we assume that, we don't assume, but majority of this country assumes that family is a very loving, caring space for disabled people. And this marriage becomes a very important issue in normalizing so-called disability or shifting the responsibility from parents to another home. But this suffering that is meted out and lived with on a daily basis, I mean, really robs one's personhood. And I think somewhere work done by Sama, work done by people like Rohini and, Shampa, as well as the Sanghamitra, are very, very important areas. They're very complicated areas, but I think it has been a great eye-opener to the kind of how we even frame questions around these issues and how we foreground it. I think with these few comments, I will hand over the platform for the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have some time to hear some comments, take some questions specific to any speaker or in general. Let's start with Dr. Mira Shiva. Mira?
See, there are 2-3 questions. So one question to Rohini, that is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis comes under multiple sclerosis, because our friend Kalpana Mehta from Saheli, she had it, suffered, and we lost her with that. That was one question. Second question was about whether the gene therapy and the gene editing, what is the cost at present? And the second question related to that is, who holds the intellectual property right patent for gene editing? Because it's under CRISPR, and as far as I know, that patents are held by some entity. Huh? The third question I wanted to ask was related to getting this certificate, the disability certificate, that, I realize the difficulty in, where you cannot see where the pain and all, which is not visible. But even for people, for women, especially women, elderly women who should be getting widow's pension, who should be getting, the elderly pension, huh? And who should be getting the disability because they can't walk, can't eat, can't do anything. For the disability bit, huh? I am aware that the doctors asking bribe of 1,000 rupees when someone is physically, visibly, grossly disabled. So are there cases, my question would be, that in getting these disability certificates in the study Sarojini and you all did, that did you come across that to get the certificates, the medical professionals are asking for a bribe?
Firstly, thanks a lot to Sama for organizing this absolutely brilliant webinar. And following on from the discussion, I think I really wanted to pick up on one of the points that Shampa made, which I think is very important in terms of the views of the framework of intersectionality and saying, how do we actually frame the problem? And I've got a question to the whole of the panel and the speakers and the group of activists who are assembled today, which is the kind of ethical question I faced when I was in the field, and I've been working in the area for the last 7-8 years, looking at sickle cell and thalassemia in different parts of India. Was that I thought when I went into the field, I was very struck by this fact of the absolute conflict between the two models of treatment and care, lack of treatment and care, and the focus in policy domain and the rhetoric of eliminating sickle cell by a certain, and this has been happening for decades. It's not a recent thing. But what really struck me was speaking to we had a sample of something like 51 families across 3 different states in India, and speaking to patients and carers from families in very remote areas as well, in urban areas like Delhi, and very well educated, some of the people, less educated as well. I was very struck by the fact that this idea of prevention was equally shared across the board. So that, it wasn't as if the patients were they were speaking for the rights of the disabled, disability rights on the one hand, and also speaking for we need to really eliminate the disease as soon as we can. So prevention is one of our major foci in our demands for, better service. So I found this tension very difficult to handle, because then it made me realize, is it that from a upper middle class background of being an academic who's come from outside, or even as an Indian academic, we look at the issues of reproductive justice and rights from a certain perspective where I'm finding it very hard to understand why is it that an average, even middle class activist within the area who's actually suffering from sickle cell themselves does not see a tension between these two needs. And why is it that they have been asking for prevention themselves? So I would like to open that to discussion, but I can share my own my own understanding is that basically the care is so poor and the prognosis seems so dismal the way it's been projected, especially for the older patients who have lived with very long-term serious chronic disabilities over a longer period of time, that the parents actually basically think that there's actually no future for them, which I find very sad. But I would really like to sort of open this out to discussion to see how are we really actually framing these. Where does this terminology come from? And how does that match with the ground reality that we're talking about?
Thanks, Professor Sanghamitra. Ritesh Kumar, do you want to share your comment or question that you have for the speakers?
Thank you, ma'am, for organizing this meeting today. For Sanghamitra ji knows me very well. Her PhD topic and the title, Our Blood Itself is Disabled. She met me, and that quote comes out from my side. Ma'am, in this journey of sickle cell disease, I am a sickle cell disease, and later on I got through lung cancer. I have been using hydroxyurea since 2006 regularly, and today I'm very much impressed by Sama ma'am. She mentioned here for CRPD, where barriers, she was talking about the barriers, because I have been struggling for my disability certificate for last 6 years. Now I got the permanent disability certificate, 70%. In this, yes, and I can say that I'm lucky to convince the doctors that I am a disabled because I have all the documents. The mindset is very poor. Before 6 years, when I met to my CMHO, he told me get out because you are coming through walking. You are able to walk. You can sit. You can talk. Then why you need disability certificate? That time I told that our blood itself is disabled. Then how can you say that? So I am struggling this, and man, the sense of urgency. Even I got a disability certificate, but there is no use. The using of this. I am in the age of 40. Okay, I lost my education barrier. I lost everything. Means I am not eligible for any government or any educational institute. Okay, so in the sense of urgency is no one focusing. Where we are all focusing on preventing the SCD, research, everything. But what about us? We are living here also. So how can we generate the sense of urgency to make focus on these policies? How can we amendment these things? How can we can give the complete entitlement of CRPWDF? This is my question.
This is Dr. Yogesh Karkonde. I work with improving care for sickle cell disease in a few districts of Chhattisgarh, and essentially working at the grassroots level. So one of the challenges that even if patients with sickle cell anemia they get a disability certificate, they may not often get the pension because the state rules are very different, and so getting sickle cell certificate becomes one thing, and then getting the actual monetary or non-monetary benefits is the second hurdle. So something, I think that's also an area that needs to be highlighted and worked upon. Getting the disability certificate itself is a long journey, and after you cross that long journey, again, you don't see anything, beneficial coming your way. So that's a big area of work. And secondly, I realized that doctors themselves need to be sensitized. So a lot of doctors who sit in these disability boards, they actually don't have any mechanism for continuous education in terms of giving disability certificates. They often stick to old rules. They're not often not aware of the recent changes. So, for example, for sickle cell disease in Chhattisgarh, we had to sort of personally go and show the change rules for permanent disability for sickle cell anemia patients. And even with that, some of the doctors resisted. So we had to work with the collectors to get them sort of sensitized. But this issue is there. I mean, even in terms of going in for doctors training, it's heavily giving disability is heavily based on the physical disability. Not even we often struggle to get disability certificates for mental health disease patients. So that's another area of work where I think efforts need to be put on.
So I don't see any more hands at this moment. So may I request Rohini, Sarojini, and Sanghamitra. Rohini, do you want to go first?
I think I'm not clear on Mira's question. I think, did she ask if ALS and MS are the same? Am I right in hearing that?
That's right. I think she asked. I'm sorry, I'm going to intervene here. I'm a neurologist, so can comment. Just
please,
a quick comment.
Yes.
So ALS and MS are very different diseases. Both are sort of, ALS is much more devastating and takes you down faster.
Yes.
So sorry, then can I add? Then if AMS is more devastating, and I know 3 people who sort of passed away with that, if multiple sclerosis is covered, is this also covered under the disability thing?
So the person with ALS will get disability based on the musculoskeletal, because in ALS what you see is severe muscle weakness. So the person can't use their hands or legs and eventually stop walking. So for them, they will get disability through this musculoskeletal weakness.
Can't speak, can't comb hair, can't do anything. And where will they go getting a certificate,
Sangeeta, Thanks for raising this important question. In fact, at the round table, three of us, I think Keertana, you can also chip in. Like we had a presentation looking at the policy, but we were looking from the, feminist and intersectional lens, interpreting the entire policy. It's not just there, the question of the entire, the language of elimination, eradication, and this target-based kind of things, which we know, what is happening with tuberculosis already in the country. And then again, malaria is coming back. So not only from that, the medical, but even from the other, from the lives of the women, particularly marginalized women, what it means, and also the eugenics, which will come with that. I think that was, but what we try to interpret there is the policy is not about prevention, but preventing births. That's what we were trying to articulate in a presentation, where we have seen both in our own, the target-based approach is elimination. Courts is only looking into the premarital and then prenatal, and also the, the genetic counseling and all that. Within that, it is the main objective is to prevent birth so that you may not have a sickle cell child. So that is what is very important for us as feminists, talking about reproductive justice and reproductive governance to look into. And the last point, I think Sanghamitra can come there again. I agree with Yogesh. Thanks so much. The sensitizing the doctors, definitely, which is very, very important. Our own experiences showed very clearly that, you make the person with disability to go around, and then, it's not that, even though it is free, the tests and all that, but the time which you spend, that itself is very, very stressful and painful. And at the end, anyway, the main goal for many people is about a government job. When that particular government job is not allocated to the persons with sickle cell disease, that created a lot of outrage, anxiety, and then some kind of disillusion, like whatever you say, the other pensions will be there and all that. But that itself, the fundamental thing is not there, but you are giving the other bits and pieces in the act. On the CRISPR, of course, we did work quite a bit on that. I just shared one piece, and then there is another piece which we have written. We are also looking into genetic and biotechnologies. But again, there is this, like when we do not have the basic hydroxyurea, or we do not have any, the blood transfusion at the tertiary, even at the tertiary level, or, even the counseling. So how can we think about the, CRISPR? Of course, in the paper, we spoke about where is it happening, what is happening. It will be very soon in our country, and many people from Indian scientists are looking at it. I'm not undermining the science. I'm not undermining the advancement in science, but at the same time, the science should be, equitable, ethical, and affordable. That is something very, very important without any long-term consequences to the health and in the project. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with everything that Sarojini said. I'll start with the question that Professor Chatu just posed. I feel like the way that I have encountered the same problem, like it's not the same as, say, for example, disability activism for cochlear implants or deaf words, right? Like sickle cell disease. One of the things that I want to emphasize on when looking at this problem from a feminist lens is the emotional aspect of sickle cell disease, the affective dimension. It is a very, very painful disease, and it is a disease that includes recurrent episodes of pain, right? So it is only natural that we don't romanticize in a manner that we expect people living with disability, sickle cell disability, to say that, oh, no, no, we want more people with sickle cell so that we have a community. It's not as simple as that. But at the same time, the reproductive justice issue for me is hinged on the fact that there is not enough awareness, so much so that Dr. Kalkonde just said, right? There is a necessity to include sickle cell treatment in regular medical curricula. There are so many places where people don't even know how to treat the disease. And there is mistreatment, misdiagnosis. So when there is a culture of lack of complete awareness, there is a presence of lack of targeted screening. That is something we have to evaluate in a holistic manner. If we have enough information available in the public domain and people affected by the condition are themselves coming and asking for prevention, I think it would not be amiss with the reproductive justice framework at all. It would in fact be folded into the reproductive justice framework if the people themselves are calling for it. But if we don't account for stigma, if we don't account for further discrimination, that's where the reproductive justice framework becomes so potent in critiquing these uncritical public health interventions. That is my take on it. The other question was about the cost of gene therapy. I'm so glad to see Ritesh ji in the audience, because my whole paper, the idea for the paper, developed in conversation with Ritesh ji. Well, I don't think any person from the sickle cell community would say no to gene therapy, but the dimensions, the cost prohibitive dimensions of this new therapy is so high. At present, I think to answer Meera's question, it is up to the millions. Compare that with hydroxyurea, which is like a couple of rupees per tablet, but even that is inconsistent. So that a political economy of medicines, that is also something that needs to be a reproductive justice issue. What is this political economy of medicines that we are looking towards, where futuristic technology is more salvaging or more like hopeful than something that already exists that can be improved through more investment in public health funding, right? Like more state investment in this problem. So I feel like those are the things that these are the nuances that will make sickle cell care better for people who live with the condition, and not just prevention as the ultimate goal for sickle cell management.
I'll just say a couple of things. Just also with MS, employment is also not included. They're not in part of the 4%. So there's many similar issues that then I just keep wondering how things can be brought together, because even in terms of costs of medicine for people with MS, doctors, yes, a big issue of not being aware, firstly, of what the condition is, and doctors not also prescribing generic medicines, because there's been a huge improvement with generic medicines, the disease-modifying drugs, and they're much cheaper than the other branded drugs, but there's not enough that the doctors don't push it. They're worried that, it may not work, so there's all kinds of things. And I just want to end this discussion with how one can collate this information, because there's a lot of overlap. Not a lot, because the diseases are different, but there's some major overlapping issues that different conditions have, not just MS and sickle cell.
Yeah, so we are almost there on time, so we could take like an additional 5 minutes just to hear from some of you who have been actively writing on the chat box too. If you really feel like coming in, just in the flow of the discussion, please do so. Also, thank you so much for all of you who have written down, your questions and comments. It has really added to the discussion. Anthony, please go ahead.
I just want to focus on two aspects. One is availability of hydroxyurea at PHC level. It is in many states under the essential medicine list. Just see that procurement is sustained and supply is not erratic, so that at PHC level it can be available. Number one. Number two is disability certificate. The moment it is once diagnosed, it should be eligible. The disability certificate should be automatic. Now in Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, once FIR is lodged, you don't have to, it's not at the mercy of a police officer. Once anybody can input their complaint, and it is the system to verify it is a genuine case and to file FIR. Same should be in the disability certification. The archaic, board meeting, how much is the level of disability should all vanish. The very diagnosis should be eligible in the system, computerized system, that patient from particular PHC is eligible for the thing. It is out, it is the system's headache, whether when you issue and things like that. Once a patient has come, diagnosis is made, it should be automatically eligible. We all must champion for that demand. It is not a mercy gift from a CMO, and DMO's sarcastic comments and all should be avoided. And we need a lot of sensitization for the doctors, especially those who are in the certification board. Thank you.